Hi everyone, my name is Nisreen Kamal. I am the Arabic editor of the China Global South project. And let me tell you a little bit about the work we're doing before you get to today's podcast. So basically, if you check the news to look for stories about China's ties with the United States or Europe, you will definitely find a lot. But when it comes to stories about China's relations with developing countries, which we call the Global South, it's a different situation. So this is where we come in because we provide you with in-depth analysis and daily reporting about China's activities in Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and even the Americas. And our services are available in 3 languages, which are English, Arabic, and French. So you can subscribe to our services for only $15 a month. You can try it for free for 30 days at chinaglobalsouth.com/subscribe. Once again, that's chinaglobalsouth.com/subscribe. Thank you.
The China in Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on China-Africa relations through training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.com.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by China Global South's managing editor, Cobus van Staden in Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good morning to you, Cobus.
Good morning.
And we're thrilled to have back on the show our own Francophone editor, Geraud Neema. Bonjour to you. Again, a very good morning as well.
Bonjour and good morning to you, Eric.
Well, the Golden Week holiday in China is coming to an end this week. The Chinese have been off all week. The National Day holiday was, I think, last Saturday. And as part of the National Day holiday, typically in China, it's like the July 4th weekend in the United States or July 14th, Bastille Day in France. And it brings up a lot of patriotism. And what do people do when they want to feel patriotic? Not just in China, but in a lot of countries. Well, they go to the movies, and this year they went to the movies, and the big blockbuster this year was a movie called Homecoming. As of Wednesday, it took in $115 million across the country. It's still only being shown in China right now, but it definitely captured a lot of the headlines. The story is set in the fictitious country of Numia Republic in North Africa back in 2011. You got to love the names, guys, that they come up for these fake countries. And it's told from the perspective of 2 Chinese diplomats, Zhong Dawei and Cheng Lang, who are ordered to assist the evacuation of 125 stranded Chinese nationals when war breaks out again in this fictitious country. The movie is directed by Zhao Xiaozhi and also starring Zhang Yi, Wang Junkai, and Yin Tao. These are all big, mega blockbuster superstars in China. And for those of you who may not be familiar with what happened in North Africa back in 2011, it's actually based on real events and the outbreak of civil war in Libya. Back then, China evacuated 30,000 of its nationals. So just so you have a little better understanding of what actually happened back then, let me play you a little bit of sound from Chinese state broadcaster CGTN about how they covered that story back then. And this will set up the context for the movie.
The Chinese embassy to Libya has facilitated the evacuation of more Chinese nationals out of the warring country. According to the embassy, 878 Chinese nationals have been evacuated since the conflict began, while some 260 more will leave the country by plane in the coming days. A few dozen Chinese workers have decided to stay in the country. The embassy again issued warnings to all Chinese expatriates still in Libya, urging them to leave the country as soon as possible. Chinese working teams have arrived at the border between Libya and Tunisia to help Chinese nationals pull out.
Buckle up your seatbelts, get the adrenaline going, and here's a little bit of sound from Homecoming. What do we do? That's what they're saying. Never assume the worst is what he's saying. China will never leave any citizen behind. We must bring everyone home, said the geriatric leader who was probably some dignitary and some high-level official in China. And the movie, Cobus and Geraud, one of the phenomena that came out of this was people on Weibo were posting pictures of their fellow cinema goers crying. And it really is this massive injection of patriotism. Cobus, what was your take on Homecoming, the phenomena of the past week, the movie, and what it says about the continuation of these narratives that we see coming out of Chinese entertainment about fictitious African countries that are rooted in real events?
Yeah, I found that the continued setting of Africa, or the continued use of Africa as a setting, is very interesting. Obviously, I guess it's a testament to the centrality of Africa in this kind of early phase of China's kind of international outreach, and it gives you the feeling that maybe they're in a new phase of that outreach, or maybe they feel that they're in a new phase of that outreach now, because so many of these movies are retrospective, or like so it feels like it's that kind of African engagement is already kind of lies in China's mythical past in a way. So that's very interesting. And then also, this kind of continued theme of citizens being rescued, and the kind of long arm of the state, the kind of like, comforting long arm of the state, kind of coming to hug you, kind of transnationally, that's a very interesting theme. I mean, in a lot of ways, these movies are based on, or like seem to me very influenced by 1980s kind of American action movies like Rambo, for example. And but it is very interesting that in the case of Rambo, it's almost always the individual against the state, or the individual against corrupt state agents. But in this case, the state is not corrupt, right? Kind of like the state is there to help, and that's a kind of interesting flip, on those conventions.
And Geraud, what's very interesting about all of these movies, and we're going to play some sound and discuss Operation Red Sea, and then, of course, Wolf Warrior 2 and some others later on, so we can reference that in detail. But one of the themes from all of these movies, as Cobus mentioned, is that it does seem to parallel a lot of the Western tropes about Africa. Number one, Africans and the continent itself and the place seem to be props in these movies. And there's no agency to the place and the people. And again, that's the typical type of racist portrayal of Africa and developing countries that white people have done for decades, if not centuries, in their framing of these stories. And so there's a lot of similarities to me in terms of the stereotypical caricatures of Africa, Africans, and also this idea that, outside there, over there is this chaotic world. And we are this kind of bastion of stability that's coming to rescue our people from this chaos. So the outside world is chaos, and at home, things are nice and stable. How do you kind of see these themes that Cobus talked about with Rambo and some of the ideas that I'm kind of putting out there?
So Eric, you've mentioned it's the continuance of a certain narrative that we've seen with Western movies, American movies, and even some European movies. The context remained the same, as you mentioned, that African, even in terms of the setting itself, in the movies, Africans remains prop. They are not the main character of the movie. They're not the main actors. So the narrative about them is really quite. It's more depending on the main character of the Chinese stakeholders in the movies, the Chinese actors in the movie. That's only in the setting of the movie. But on the story itself in the movie, we keep on playing on that narrative of Africa being the chaotic continent where every war happens or every disease happens and where we need to come and save people from. Even though the country itself is a fictitious country, but we can see, as you said it earlier, it's rooted on the real event stories. But we kind of feel that the narrative remained the same, that if we want to play a place where we're going to be saving people, where we're going to be rescuing people, we have to rescue them from Africa. We have to rescue them from somewhere in the Middle East, in the chaotic region of the Middle East. And it's really interesting that Chinese movies keep on playing on that perspective, while when you see in the media, a few months ago, we interviewed some expert when we were talking about Chinese media, how they were trying, on the media side, they were trying to see that we are portraying a good image of Africa, that, in Africa, we are trying, there are things that everything is not war, everything is not disease. But when it comes to play the Chinese savior, they're playing exactly in the same narrative with the Westerns, where, in Africa, we are coming to play as the savior one. So it's quite interesting, and I'd say in certain level.
Yeah, that's an interesting contrast. Cobus, you and I have spoken with a number of Chinese scholars who talked about, I think it's called constructive news or positive news, where this whole idea, what's it called?
Positive journalism.
Positive journalism. So on the state media side, the CGTN side, you're right, Geraud, they're really trying to downplay the chaos and that Africa's full of positive stories. But on the entertainment side of things, here is a totally different story. And interestingly enough, in the positioning of CGTN against, say, BBC or CNN, when they say you only focus on the negatives, it does seem like the backstories of these big movies are all about war, chaos, disease, famine, all of the different tropes. But Cobus, you follow entertainment very closely, and you also think a lot about the framing of Africa in mass entertainment. So we've talked about Rambo, which was in the 80s when I was a kid, and one of the hallmarks of Rambo was that he kills tons of people. I mean, the body count in Rambo must have been in the hundreds, if not thousands. And that was something similar in what we saw in Wolf Warrior 2, where they just, kill tons of people. Has Western cinema advanced past Rambo in its framing of Africa, or they're not doing much anymore? I can't remember the last movie that was set in a place like Africa. Or are the Chinese kind of picking up something that the West left behind, and the Western media now is more sensitive to some of those portrayals?
Well, obviously, okay. There's a few things. One is, I think that Western media is just in a space of, because of the power of a free social media. Like, I think Western media is just in a place of more conversations about these things. So I don't think the portrayals have necessarily stopped, but the prominent ones come in for more criticism. But I think Africa plays a bigger role in these Chinese movies than they did in Hollywood, kind of influences. Because, for example, Rambo is set in Vietnam, right? So maybe more specifically the kind of iconic second Rambo, the sequel is largely set in Vietnam. And there, I think, obviously a lot of those 80s movies were in different kind of ways, kind of working through or reframing, retelling kind of like wartime trauma for Americans. So Africa has shown up as this kind of like chaotic kind of backwater or chaotic setting, but not consistently. I think in Western movies, like if like something like Black Hawk Down, for example, is a famous example. But I don't think there is necessarily over the last while such a kind of consistent use of Africa in this particular way. I think the way this kind of like set of Chinese kind of blockbusters, I think, do that in like more conclusively than than the West. Whereas I think the West would frequently they would kind of mix it up, and just like sometimes Southeast Asia, sometimes South America. It's like different parts of the global South, and showing up as these kind of chaotic backdrops, and frequently. Also, kind of we in the West, we're also living in the era now, I think, very amplified by Netflix, of the kind of transnational thriller. Kind of like you're in Estonia, then you're jumping, then you're in Benin. Like 10 minutes in per country. It's interesting that the Chinese are focusing on, a coherent kind of. A coherent setting where the protagonists don't kind of skip out and jump to other places, kind of Jason Bourne style or James Bond style, but then also that these consistent settings are so frequently in Africa, more frequently than I think Western movies.
Well, there's also a lot taking place in the Middle East, and in Operation Red Sea, which also stars Zhao Ni, by the way, who was in Homecoming, a special Chinese military task force is deployed to the fictitious country of Iwa. I think that's how you say it, IHWEA. I wonder how they come up with these names, but that's kind of okay. Iwa sounds like an IKEA couch, I think. And it's a story that's loosely based on, again, another evacuation of Chinese citizens, this time from Yemen back in 2015. And again, these clips are in Chinese, so many of you will not understand what they're actually saying, but that's not quite the point here. The point is for you to get the tone, the vibe, and also to hear some of the similarities in each of the trailers. So let's take a listen to Operation Red Sea from 2018. And this one is targeted at terrorists.
我们这次行动的决心，就是要让恐怖组织知道，一个中国人都不能伤害。舰长，车上的武器已向我舰发射，进入一级战斗部署。
Big bang, boom, there you go. The mission, here's what they said. The mission is a message to all terrorists. You will never harm a Chinese citizen. Pretty cool. And then what they do is, if you have to picture, all of the visuals there are of PLA Navy ships with these really big guns and, commandos who are decked out. And in Geraud, it makes me think a little bit of this idea of terrorists not harming a Chinese citizen and what we saw last year in the Eastern DRC with, terrorists harming lots of Chinese citizens through kidnappings, through assaults and whatnot. And the Chinese embassy response was not send in the Delta Force to get these folks out. It was, well, you have until December 5th to get out, and then you're on your own. So a very slightly different message than what we're seeing in some of these movies. But when it comes to this terrorism message, that one speaks to your country and what's been going on.
Yes, exactly that. It really speaks to countries like mine, like Nigeria, where we see a lot of Chinese being abducted, kidnapped, and killed even in different areas. And it's the same message that they said in DRC is the same message the Chinese embassy in Nigeria also said to its people in different regions. That region is very dangerous. You should evacuate by this time. So beyond that time, we won't guarantee your safety in that region. So it's quite very paradoxal to see that approach. Like in a movie setting, we say, we will not let any Chinese citizen being harmed. In the other one, in the real life, the situation is different. And I think in the real life, they're more confronted to the reality that, in their own foreign policy, we won't get involved in people in foreign countries' sovereignty or in foreign countries' internal affairs. But even if it involves Chinese citizen. But the longer we go in that context, the longer they get engaged in different parts of the global south where safety is becoming some of issues. And we saw last week this week, I think, where they sent public officials to DRC and Nigeria to speak with the officials of this country. The more we see those kind of engagement in terms of Chinese safety, we might even in the future starting to see much more engagement in the safety of the citizen. Will they go like in the movie to say, no Chinese citizen will be harmed, or we won't let any Chinese citizen to be harmed? I don't think so, but I do believe that in a certain extent, with Chinese being employed in big state-owned companies or enterprise, they will try to send a message that we can keep our people safe. But not all of them, I'm not sure, but most of them will try, at least for the state-owned company, to say, okay, we can keep our workers safe, and yes, we are the Chinese, and we are becoming more and more powerful.
So there's some great research that's been done by noted Africa-China scholar Paul Nantulia in Washington. He's at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies, and he follows quite closely on joint military operations or police operations. Let me just call them security operations because I'm not exactly sure what branch of the forces are there. We reported on this last year, Cobus. I think it was in Uganda that Chinese special forces deployed with Ugandan special forces in order to get people on China's most wanted list. So they will pursue criminals that are on their most wanted list. That happens quite a bit here in Southeast Asia as well. We haven't seen it quite as much in the space of rescuing Chinese nationals. In fact, Chinese companies have a long reputation of paying ransoms for abducted employees more than rescuing them. It's just because it's a pragmatic way. So in Mali earlier this year, a number of Chinese were freed just suddenly, and the suspicion was that the ransoms had been paid. And that's one of the reasons why people think that Boko Haram, also in the Eastern DRC and in other places, they target Chinese more than other nationalities because there is the perception that they will be paid ransoms in exchange for releasing hostages. Again, hard to tell that because there isn't a lot of data about it. But Cobus, when we think about these movies, I'm going to play some sound from Wolf Warrior 2, and I want you to kind of go back into the mental archive and pick up what Wolf Warrior 2 was like. It's inconceivable that this would ever happen overseas simply because of what Geraud said and this doctrine of non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries. Can you imagine if an action star like Wu Jing, who's the star of Wolf Warrior, if he was in real life and just, killing dozens of Africans and going through neighborhoods and just, driving through and destroying homes and blowing up factories and things like that, what the optics of that would look like in real life for the Chinese. So let's take a listen to Wolf Warrior 2, and then Cobus, I'd like to come back to you to get your take on all this and start to wrap all of this together.
Our facial recognition crew uploaded
Video of this man fighting off some of the pirates. His name's Lang.
Wolf Warrior, welcome to Africa.
是进入交战区，但我们要坚决完成撤侨。
好像是反政府武装那边的一个什么标记。
And basically now it just is kick ass for 2 hours. And Cobus, my favorite part of this movie was when, you remember when they were driving and he's with the, I think presumably the white American woman who happens to speak fluent Chinese, and they're in this savannah and he says, you know, where's your government? She says, well, I tweeted them and I did an @US embassy. And then the camera pulls back as they drive by and conveniently there are lions and giraffes. And it was just every African cliche and trope just right packaged into a good 60 seconds. So they are the granddaddy of all of these movies. Wolf Warrior brought in almost $1 billion. It set the tone. In many ways, I think we're seeing so many of these movies that have a similar formula as Wolf Warrior because it made so much money. But what does Wolf Warrior mean in terms of the understanding of these cultural studies?
Well, you know, Wolf Warrior is such a key text, you know, not to sound like an academic, but it's interesting for me how, you know, like all of these movies that is kind of dramatizing not only the dangers, but like kind of ambivalently dramatizing this kind of presence of Chinese people internationally. You know, on the one hand, facing all these dangers, but on the other hand, also dominating the landscape, you know, kind of like striding around, kicking down doors, doing whatever they need to do. But then at the same time, already having, like by the time the movie starts, usually these Chinese people are already out there busy doing good, right? Kind of so all of that is like this kind of complex negotiation about, you know, kind of China's international presence. It strikes me, you know, that there's a lot of like back and forth, a lot of ambivalence about the different kind of aspects of being Chinese in the world and the kind of like the kind of growing presence of China in the world. But it's all happening during a time when there's such kind of massive social centralization, you know, kind of under Xi Jinping, you know, kind of where the party kind of like stepped back into this kind of central role in Chinese society, and then kind of, you know, kind of reorganize everything around it in a way, you know. So that kind of combination of things is very interesting for me, you know, kind of like as life in China becomes more securitized and more kind of party centric, there's all of this, you know, all of these kind of depictions of the party kind of moving out in, or this is kind of party state kind of moving out into the world in order to keep the citizens safe, but then at the same time the presence of the citizens in the world is both good and bad, you know, and there seems to be a kind of this kind of complex negotiation, you know, kind of with a population that's not necessarily used to having this huge international presence, and now they have, right? Kind of like China kind of like at some stage kind of like passed that kind of some kind of international superpower benchmark where it now has all of these massive interests overseas that it can't just easily pull back into itself. And it seems to me that there's a lot of kind of public anxiety around that, and that a lot of these movies are kind of playing into those kind of things, you know, kind of like they're playing into the ambivalence of being both influential around the world and at the same time, you know, kind of exposed around the world.
I'd like to add something to what Cobus said, Eric. There is also that need of projecting power, to show that we're projecting power, that we are getting and more assertive in our foreign policy, that we are able to protect our people. But it's a kind of double-edged sword, because in a case where they set up the movie on Africa, for example, it's a double-edged, because in Africa they want to show at the same time they are powerful, but they're also protective. You know, they can be good. They can be good by projecting their power, by securing people, by rescuing people. Like in Wolf Warrior, we can really rescue people from different dangers. We can also do that. But in the same time, by using all the stereotypes that we know about Africa, things that some they're real, some they're not real, but by using all the stereotypes in the same time, they're reinforcing the same image they are trying trying to fight about Africa, And right now, for example, if I was in China, I wouldn't be like, as an African, you could expect Chinese to believe that after watching those movies, your country is really, it's really unsafe, and we're really gonna come and save you in the same. We can come and save you because it's not really a safe place for you. But from an African perspective in Africa, like, you guys, you are coming in Africa, you want to show us that you are good, you are different from the West, but you keep on putting us in a bad perspective out in the world that we are still this continent where you find wars and where you find all the disease. So at the end, they kind of working on this double-edged sword that Western media and Western entertainment they did not have to, because the West in Africa, it was not like we are the savior. They have their own past with Africa, so they could allow themselves to make the kind of movie where Africa or Middle East is like a place of chaos that we are coming to rescue people. But the Chinese, when they came with the message that we are different, we are respecting you, and when they do that, you cannot in the same time also projecting power by using Africa as a prop of bad places of every instability that you can save people from.
Well, I think there's also something very interesting there, because I think obviously kind of Hollywood portrayals of these things are older, right? And so they stretch back over other kind of geopolitical, eras. And there's many of these movies, old kind of Hollywood movies that, set, for example, in the Cold War, kind of like we're good and we're up against, the Soviets, but in country X, right? Kind of like in the thirds. And so, in a lot of ways, this something like Wolf Warrior is a similar kind of thing of like where it's not only about the presence of Chinese power, but it's this kind of referendum on which kind of external superpower power is good or bad, kind of like America versus China. But then it's also interesting how on the Chinese side, frequently, if you watch something like Wolf Warrior, the crisis in Africa, in the crisis in that fictional African country frequently has a direct cause, a starting point, and and there's a kind of instrumentalist kind of view of what caused this problem. And then in Wolf Warrior specifically, it was caused by these mercenaries, these kind of Western mercenaries. If you compare it to something like, I don't know, did any of you see it's Beyond Borders? Like it's a Angelina Jolie movie from the I think early 2000s, where she plays an aid worker. So it's like this kind of like it's a weird movie to watch. It's like it's like aid workers falling in love with the background of like some horrible war scene behind them, But like what's interesting there in contrast is that in Beyond Borders there is no start. There was no like original cause of this kind of African chaos. But when you arrive, Africa is just already a chaotic place. I don't even know if it's in Africa actually. It's like it's it's in the global south, and they actually jump from kind of war scene to war scene as well. But kind of the point being that in the case of Wolf Warrior, there is a cause to all of this chaos and dysfunction, right? And that cause, to a certain extent, is bad external power, and that's now being fixed by good Chinese external power. Whereas in the case of something like Beyond Borders or kind of later era, like something like Black Hawk Down as well, there's this kind of feeling of like, oh, these places are just terrible. They're just like, it's the kind of movie version of Donald Trump's asshole countries. It's just like these countries are just fundamentally terrible, and there's no reason. We don't need to give any particular reason why they're so terrible. They're just terrible. So that's an interesting contrast for me. There's that kind of, it seems to kind of like pull towards like more fundamental kind of ways of thinking about the global south.
Well, let's look at the savior complex as part of it. We've talked a lot about in the past, and there's a trope about the white savior, the white female savior specifically, Angelina Jolie. Many action movies tend to have the Red Cross worker, again, as a white woman. That's very, very typical out of Hollywood. So we're starting to see some of the same iconography and imagery coming into these Chinese narratives. And there's one that's really interesting. It's called Ebola Fighters. That came out earlier this year. It's a 24-part streaming series produced by Tencent. That was really a huge hit. People loved it, but it was only available on streaming. By the way, if you're interested in this and you don't speak Chinese, all 24 episodes are now available on YouTube, and then somebody translated and put subtitles in it. So if you want to watch Ebola Fighters, just look up Ebola Fighters and you'll see all 24 episodes that are there. Like other of the movies, this one was set in a fictitious African country, but it's based on China's response to the Ebola crisis in West Africa in 2014. In this trailer, you're going to hear a little bit of a different tone.
走的时候，他痛苦吗？
So rather than shooting things up and blowing things up and evacuating people, this is all about a passionate team of Chinese medical workers who go to this West African country and are, risking their lives and doing everything to save these people from Ebola. By the way, that actually did happen. I mean, the Chinese, like the Americans, and many countries sent personnel to West Africa in 2014. And so I don't want to take anything away from that. But what is so interesting about Ebola fighters, though, and I'd like to get both of your takes on this, is how one of the differences between, say, Hollywood and Chinese cinema is that you can tell that the scripts in Chinese cinema have been written in conjunction with the government. Because just the way they present the flag and the way they put the handshakes, they mirror so much of the diplomatic iconography that we see in our daily China-Africa coverage. And again, there's this subtle tone, Cobus, that you've brought up over and over again, is that we are here and the West either caused this problem or they're not here. And again, it's very much a part of the framing. These shows, to be clear, are not meant for African audience, Western audiences. They are meant exclusively for Chinese domestic audiences. And so they are sending back signals about Chinese patriotism, Chinese politics, the Chinese role in the world, win-win diplomacy, shared prosperity. All of these propaganda tools that are common in, again, the diplomacy are also very common in the entertainment. So, Geraud, let's start with you, talking a little bit about the savior complex. And again, Africa is a place to be rescued. It's a place to be evacuated from. But Africans themselves are bit parts in these narratives.
Yes, exactly. That savior complex is really, it's something that, as we said before, it's very underlying in these Chinese movies. And in the case of Ebola, I was quite a bit surprised because when you think of Ebola, and I'm going to really put it in that under this China-US engagement in Africa, when it comes to Ebola, for instance, we saw that the US did much more in terms of, for example, fighting Ebola, in terms of financing the vaccine against Ebola, in terms of really helping a lot in terms of healing and helping people on the ground than the Chinese. But when it came to, to portray it and to talk about it, the US, they did not do much, but the Chinese, they did with this kind of movies. But as you say, it's not for African audience or Western audience, it's for Chinese audience, like to portray ourselves in that position where even when it comes to, we did that in politics, we did that in war, and we also do that in health. We can also be doing that in health, helping others to provide those kind of help. I would not be surprised that in the coming maybe next year or coming month, we're going to see another one related now to COVID, how they've been, sending vaccine, how they've been sending doctors and helping out when it comes to COVID. But yes, Africa remains that place that needs a savior from itself, savior from Western involvement, because in the case of Ebola, it's different. The cause of the problem doesn't come from the West, doesn't come from outside. It's a much more internal problem to Africa itself. And we can come and help. We can come and help them, and we can project our power as on a different stage, as military, diplomatic, and on the health sector too. We can also do that.
So, Cobus, let's give the last word to you to help us kind of frame and understand all of these different movies. So many of the insights that Geraud has provided in terms of the savior complex, the agency of Africa and Africans in these movies. What should people take away from these movies like Homecoming, Wolf Warrior 2, Operation Red Sea, and even Ebola Fighters?
In the first place, I think, if you're watching a movie that happens to be set in a fictional African country, you're on shaky ground to begin with. But the constancy of Africa's kind of instrumentalization as this, in this particular way, the kind of bit part in its own setting, the having to be rescued, the being a kind of an arena, right, kind of for external power, the way that it's portrayed, I think is dispiriting. It's interesting that it's also happening at a moment when Africa itself is putting out a lot more transnational media of its own. There's a lot more more African, kind of TV series and so on, not only being produced, but also being circulated on international platforms. So, kind of when a lot of African creators, I think, are at a moment where they glimpse the potential to speak to an international audience and to kind of claim their own story in a way that wasn't allowed, before, among others because of the dominance of Hollywood, but also because of the dominance of just global North circulation systems. So all of this is happening at the same time. But I think, most dominantly, I think it seems like we're in a particular moment where, a particular moment over a several decade kind of rollout of Chinese power into the world. And, part of the role of these movies, particularly because they're happening in such a centralized system and because the movies are made by so closely in coordination with government forces, is that it becomes it can be read as a form of official messaging to an extent that you can't read Hollywood, right? And so, and therefore I think it does seem to me to be this kind of like big back and forth kind of conversation between the Chinese state and the Chinese public about what the full implications are going to be of being a superpower. One sees similar kind of waves in American cinema. Kind of, for example, as American cinema moving from the 30s to the 50s also went through kind of a similar kind of set of kind of negotiations about its own set of kind of white savior films and its own set of kind of different kind of ways of portraying these foreign encounters, right? Kind of which include action movies and comedies, musicals, and a lot of different genres. And then in the 60s and 70s, one sees a real kind of darkening of that and a real kind of questioning of all of these kind of issues, right? Kind of like about, like, is it good to be this out in the world? Is it possible to even to do good in the world? Kind of like, is everything already kind of tainted by power? It'll be interesting to see if China gets there. Kind of like, it'll be interesting to see what kind of China we're talking about by the time those kind of movies are made. Because of course, Chinese cinema is a big, complicated, sophisticated, old. There's been many Chinese cinemas in kind of through the decades. Some highly critical of state power, some not. So so it's going to be very interesting to see what happens when the political mood in China shifts over the next few years. And what kind of ambivalences about its international presence will show up in movies now? My feeling is that this is going to be, later going to look back at this kind of like wave of these movies as a kind of a indication of a particular era, and then we're going to be shifting into other eras.
Well, one thing we do know for sure is that a movie that takes in $115 million in 5 days is going to spawn more of these movies. So that is for sure. These things generate money. And because they generate money, they're going to be told over and over again. So I think there's a part of this that the Chinese audiences just absolutely love. It's understandable. It makes people feel proud. It's patriotic. I mean, those are natural emotions, no doubt. And so given that there's an appetite for it, we can expect to see more. So we'll add the future ones to our list. I'm going to put the links to all the trailers that I included in the sound today in the show notes on our website. And so if you go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com, you'll also find we've got amazing transcripts now of all the shows. So if you missed something that Cobus and Geraud said, you can go into the transcript and you can search it. That's available for subscribers. Our subscriptions to our service are super cheap, and you can pick up all the amazing insights that Cobus and Geraud and Nesrine in Cairo are doing every day at ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. We'd love for you to join our reader community. Geraud, just quickly before we go, you are managing our Patreon community. Can you tell us a little bit about what's going on over on Patreon?
So our Patreon community, I'd like first to thank our Patreon community. It's a growing community where we have people supporting us, supporting the work that we do. Because as you know, it's really not easy to be covering news impartially when it comes to Chinese engagement in the Global South. So we're really grateful to our Patreon community, those who are coming and keep on joining us, to supporting us, for us to do this independent journalism. And for all of you out there who like what we do and you really like to support us, come and join our Patreon community, patreon.com/China Global South. Yes, if I'm correct.
No, is it China Global South or China Africa? I think it's still China. No, we changed it. China Global South.
Exactly, yeah. So exactly. So you come and join us, and we have different tiers of Patreon. So we have a tier where you can have a monthly call with us, where we're gonna give you all the insight. If you want to have a one-to-one talk with us, we can give you this one. We can give you this one-to-one talk with insight of different story that we are covering. And yes, that's it. So really, I'm really expecting you guys to come and join our Patreon community, so you can have much, interactive.
And we did, in fact, Geraud and I did a briefing yesterday. A quick shout out to Stefan.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being a supporter of ours. And he has, as the top tier, he gets a monthly briefing with us. Cobus and I have done a number of these briefings with other Patreon members. So once again, patreon.com/China Global South. I think that's it. I'll put the link again in the show notes. We made some changes from China Africa, but we'll put the correct link in the show notes. So until next week, we'll have episodes both of our China Global South podcast. Everybody, of course, in the China Africa feed gets the Global South. But if you'd like to subscribe only to the Global South podcast, you can find it in all your favorite podcast directories. So we hope that you'll enjoy that program as well. We've got some great shows on India and Pakistan coming up over the next 2 weeks. So very exciting there. So for Cobus van Staden in Johannesburg, for Geraud in Mauritius, for me here in Ho Chi Minh City, thank you so much for listening. We'll be back again next week with another episode of the China in Africa podcast. Until then, see you later.
The discussion continues online. Tag us on Twitter @ChinaGSProject and visit us at ChinaGlobalSouth.com. If you speak French, check out our full coverage at projetafriquechine.com and AfriqueChine on Twitter. That's Afrique with a K. And you'll also find links to our sites and social media channels in Arabic.